This is Gemara Yevamos Daf Samoch Vav. All learning has been generously sponsored as a shchos for Shlema for Chadvalei Bas Aradina Mir Tashem. Learning the entire Chabura as we're going to begin the seventh parak of Yevamos tonight should bring Chadvalei Bas Aradina an incredible and complete refuah Shlema. As well as learning Shmig Yisrael Shel V'Zochaim V'Tvar Tamsiv Bas Baruch Shalom Levizava V'Gintel Shem and Chayab L'Mudas Bas Asima Malka. As well as a shchos for Shlema Shel Bentil Tamsiv V'Chlas Zocham Asiv V'Zablum Asbindel Chaim Moshe Yeshua Ben Malka V'Shavego Shechana B'Soich Ashar Chayli Yisrael. We pick it up, beginning a new parak, the seventh parak, 65 blot into Yevamos. Here we go, says the Mishnah. Almana L'Kayin Gadol Gusha V'Chalutza L'Kayin Hedyet. The quintessential, perhaps, forbidden marriages, as we've spoken about many times, most notably back on Daf Nun Vavam and Beis, that this is a marriage that does not result in an allowance to eat Truma. Normally, a Yisrael marries a Kayin, the Kayin's allowed to feed his wife Truma. But if it's a forbidden marriage, an Almana to Kayin Gadol, Gusha Chalutza L'Kayin Hedyet, then she cannot eat Truma. And by extension, says our Mishnah, if she brings in two types of avodim into the marriage, two types of properties, which we'll speak about in a moment, what is the difference in Avdei Malog and Avdei Tzom Barzel? Let's for a moment look at Rashi. Says the Rashi, a concept which will come up again and again, particularly when we get into Ksubis, but says Rashi that a woman brings into her marriage and they evaluate it and they write a value into the Ksuba, that this item she brought into the marriage that was worth this value. That is what we would call a nidunya, a dowry. That is says Rashi, Tsoin Barzel. Nechasim Tsoin Barzel is when she brings in something with an evaluation. It's written in the Ksuba, and for many intents and purposes that we're going to see today, it's as if the husband owns this item. That is the dowry that she brings into the marriage. But then there's another type of item that she could bring into the marriage, which is she brings in cash, and she brings in other items which are not evaluated, which are not written into the Ksuba. Then the husband just gets the benefit of eating the produce, and the principle is always hers. That is Nichsei Miluk. So Nichsei Miluk is she keeps the principle, Nichsei Sayin Barzel is the husband gets it. Says the Mishnah, in an event of this forbidden marriage of Almanah Kayin Gadol Gushachutz Kayin Hedyet, whether the woman brought in a nechsei sayin barzel, a nechsei melug, whether she brought in a dowry or she brought in an item which is more hers in the form of avadim as slaves, the halacha is avdi melug do not eat truma. Avdi sayin barzel, which we just said are more the husbands, yes, eat truma. Says the Mishnah, Ve'eluhein avdi melug. What are avdi melug? Emesu meisula, meisiru sula. Avdi melug, like we said, are not evaluated in the Ksuba, are not owned by the husband, and if they increase in value, the woman gets the increase, and if they die, the death is to the woman. Aval bi, but yet, what's the husband rights in Avdi Malog? The husband enjoys the profits, and he as well is obligated to feed these avadim. Still, because they're considered the woman's. What is Avdi Tzom Barzel? Which we said, you evaluate the dollar value, you write it into the ksuba. It's the dowry. The husband has basic ownership. That if they die, it's the husband's problem. If they benefit, it's the husband's gain. And since the husband is obligated in their responsibility, the husband, yes, feeds them chuma. So part number one of the Mishnah is, in these types of unions of forbidden marriage, the dowry written in the ksuba, yes, gets chuma. Nechsei malog, not written a dollar value in the ksuba, do not get chuma. Bas Yisrael, shenis is the kayin, and the Mishnah concludes, if we have a regular marriage of a Bas Yisrael marrying a kayin, and she brings into the marriage servants, slaves, avadim, whether they're malog, whether they're tzom barzel, whether they're evaluated, whether they're not, they yes eat chuma. And now the Mishnah continues, part number 3 we could call it, who Bas Kayin shenis the Yisrael, and the Bas Kayin which marries a Yisrael v'chnisu lo yavadim bein avdei maluk bein avdei tzom barzel harelu lo yoichlu b'tshuma. This is the opposite. The first case was a Bas Yisrael to a Kayin always gets to eat truma. Abbas koyin to Yisrael, the husband is a Yisrael, then in both cases they do not eat truma. So the focus and the topic of discussion today is types of items a woman brings into a marriage, a dowry or other movable items, and whether the husband has ownership over them, whether he feeds them chuma or not. So says the Gemara, Va'avdi malug lo yachelu b'chuma. The first part of the Mishnah, what it say? It said, Avdi malug, the items in which are really ostensibly hers, do not eat chuma. Amai, asked the Gemara, why not? We just explained in the Mishnah. The husband has to feed them. The husband gets the rights, gets the produce from them. So says the Gemara, why isn't that a level ownership? Albeit a minor level ownership. Albeit only an ownership that he gets the produce, only the ownership that he's responsible to feed them. That should be enough to allow him to feed truma. Why? Says the Gemara, it should be as if he bought a piece of property. Titania, as we learned in our Brisa, we know if a kohen marries a woman or a kohen who buys a slave, how do we know that in both cases the woman and the slave are allowed to eat truma? Shenemar says in the Torah, the kohen that when the kohen acquires something, he eats truma. And now the next step, and there's a marriage, a kohen to a woman, and the woman buys an avid, or his slaves are purchased slaves. So now we're one step removed. It's either the wife buying a slave or my slaves buying a slave. How do I know that in that case, double remove, they're still allowed to eat truma? So I asked the Gemara, I don't understand. What is the reason why in our Mishnah, when even if it's nechsei maluk, and even if they're not evaluated in ksuba and the husband does not have real ownership, but the mere fact that the husband has some level ownership, says the Gemara, why isn't that enough to allow them to eat truma? Answers the Gemara a fundamental idea with regard to feeding truma. Kol ha'oichel ma'achel koshein oichel in ma'achel. Says the Gemara, the only time one could feed his acquisitions truma is if he himself eats truma. She could feed her avadim, her acquisition truma, if she eats truma. And because, as we said in our Mishnah, this is a unique case of a forbidden union and a kohen to a Gusha v'chalutza, a kohen gadol to almana, therefore you do not get to feed them truma. Ask the Gemara about 20 lines to the bottom. The first line is Vilai. Vilai is what you're saying accurate. Vari arel, one who doesn't have a bris milah, v'chol atmeim, and one who is tamei she'eino noichlin. A kohen who's tamei can eat truma, and yet what's the dinu machilin? He is allowed to feed his acquisitions truma. So your rule doesn't stand. The rule you just told me was that if you eat, you get to feed. If you do not eat, you don't get to feed. Says the Gemara, I don't get it. A kohen who's an arel, a kohen who's a tummy doesn't eat, and yet he feeds them. Truma, explains the Gemara, no, a fundamental difference. Hasam pumayu kaivlu, over there, literally his mouth is causing pain, meaning the kohen essentially is allowed to eat truma. Right now he's tamei. The kohen could, for all intents and purposes, one that eats truma, so he feeds the next. But by us, ostensibly, essentially, within the person, the union, the marriage itself, there is a problem. Now, makes her a halal, makes her forbidden. She will never eat truma. She can never feed off truma. Says the Gemara, wait, but 1 second. We have a mamzer who was a relative of a kohen who he himself cannot eat truma, yet he feeds others truma. So now we're going to have multiple terutzim. Says the Gemara, answered Amra Avina. And these are the explanations for the first part of the Mishnah. While the kohen gadol the kohen hedyet do not feed truma to whom? To the nechsei malug, the slaves who are nechsei malug, who are not evaluated in the shtar and the ksuba. Says Ravina, kinyan oichel kamar, kinyan oichel meichel she'enoi. When we said that the person could feed a truma, it's only if it's an acquisition who eats truma, not any person. Kinyan oichel is a ma'achil, she'ein oichel einoi ma'achil, and therefore the amana the kohen gadol gushel uzachayin hadis that she herself cannot eat truma. It's not because she's pasul, because if it has to do with pasul, some mamzer is also pasul. Says the Gemara, no, it has to do with an acquisition that does not eat, and that's what she is. Therefore, she cannot feed the next level truma. Rava Amaris, teretz number 2, Midaraisa Michal Achli, says Rava, you got it right on the Daraisa level. But V'Rabbanan Udigazi Bukadei Shadoy Ma'anihi Eini Oicheles. The Rabbanan made a gezerah she cannot eat truma. Why? We want her to realize something is funny. She should think, 1 second, I got married. She's an almana. She married a kohen gadol, and she should think, wait, my husband is not feeding me truma. Number 1, Avdi, my servants in oichlin are not getting truma either, and therefore she's going to say, what's going on over here? I don't get to eat. My servants don't get to eat. Zoyne hiyatzlai. What am I, merely a zoyna with my husband? Helkach asila avuka, and therefore she's going to go and get divorced, which is of course the correct result, the fact that it's a forbidden union. So midrabanan we make a gzeira. Teretz number 3, that was Ravina, that was Rava, and comes along Ravashi, Amar Gezira Shemdeichel Achra Misa. About 10 lines to the bottom, the first one line is Shema, says Ravashi, the concern is that maybe after the husband dies, she'll continue feeding Truman. At that point you're not allowed to. But says the Gemara, asking on Ravashi, this final Teretz, Ella Mayata asked the Gemara Bas Yisrael, any time you have a regular girl who marries a kohen, she should not eat. Why? Because maybe after the husband's death, she's a regular Yisrael, she's going to continue feeding her acquisitions, which is not allowed. Ravashi comes along and he explains, no, let me tell you what I mean. The problem over here is we have an almana who she herself was a kohenes, her parents were a kohen. That's the case of the Mishnah. She married a kohen gadol. In that case, what are we worried about? She's going to come to justify and be meir heter meikara. She's going to think, when I was a single girl, achli b'truma, I ate truma from my father's house to Veinasha. In Tzveile, I got married lahai to this husband, the kohen gadol achli b'truma, and I continue eating truma. The gavroi. Now, when the husband dies, she goes back to the original state. And what's the original state? She feeds truma. So says the Gemara, if she descended from Kohanim and she married the Kohen Gadol, then there's a concern that after the death, she'll go back and continue eating truma. What's the problem? Originally, she was allowed to. Her parents were Kohanim, but now, she's not going to realize that via this forbidden marriage of the Amana the Kohen Gadol, she created herself into a halala, and that's the reason why at this point she can no longer eat truma. That is the concern. Says the Gemara, beautiful. You're right on the last narrow line. That's only if her parents were koyanim. What if she's a regular Bas Yisrael? In that case, seemingly there should be no concern. Says the Gemara, you're right, but Belmanusa, loi pli rabbanan, a good old-fashioned loi plig. Now, says the Gemara, we finished explaining the first part of the Mishnah. We finished explaining why when the woman brings in avodim nechsei malog, 4 different reasons why she cannot feed them truma. But Itmar, in the first white line, says the Gemara in the bottom of Samach Vav Amud Aleph, hamachneses shomna ba'ila. Says Rabban, hamachneses, incorrect. Itmar. Hamachneses shom lebayil. A woman who brings property into the marriage. And what happens for her husband? Again, it's shom. It was evaluated. It's nechsei soin barzel. She says, kliani noiteles. And what happens? What happens is the marriage is terminated and they get divorced. So she says, this was an item I brought into the marriage. It was evaluated. It was recorded in the ksuba. I want the item back. I want this specific item. I want the car. I want the piece of land. I want this keli. And yet the husband says, no. I'll give you the value. We evaluated it. I'll give you the value. So we have a fight between husband and wife as they're getting divorced. Can the wife demand the actual item of nechsei sayin barzel, or does the husband allowed to say, I'll pay you the value and nothing else? Hadin in me, who wins this story? Says the Gemara, it's a machlekes. Rav Yehuda Amar, says Rav Yehuda, as we turn over to Samach Vav Amud Beis, Hadin ima. she wins. Rav Ami Amar Adin Imo, he wins. Rav Yehuda Amar Adin Imo, what's the reason Rav Yehuda says? What's the reason why Rabbi Yehuda says that it works? Mishom Meshevach Beisavia Dida Hava. Because where did this item originally come from? This item came from Shevach Beisavia. This item came, it's a family heirloom. It came from her father's household, so she gets to get it back. That's Rabbi Yehuda. Rav Ami says, no, Adini Ma, he gets it back. Why? Since we learned in the Mishnah that if the same Barzal Avadim die, it's his problem. If they get better, it's his benefit. And therefore, the same reason over here, he gets to keep the item. So fundamental machlek is Rav Ami and Rav Yehuda, who keeps the item of Soin Barzel properties in the event of a divorce. So says the Gemara, this Rav Yehuda, the second sheet over here is saying that the husband wins, brought a raya from our Mishnah. Our Mishnah said, that he's responsible. Amar Rav Safra, is that a raya? Mikatani vehein shaloi. Does the Mishnah say they're his? Of course not. It says since you're liable, that's the reason why you have the responsibility. But it's not a raya that the item itself is the husband's. Maybe the item goes back to the woman at divorce, but he just had the responsibility for it. So says the Gemara. 1 second. You just told me a rule that when you're responsible, you can feed truma. But now we learned in the Mishnah, if Yisrael rents a cow from a kohen, he can feed it truma. When the kohen rents a cow, even though, of course, when you rent an animal, you're obligated to feed that animal, still. You cannot feed a truma, even though based on what you just said, if it's a kinyan, if there's a responsibility, you should feed a truma. Retorts the Gemara back 10 lines down. You're a renter, so a renter is a chayiv for a oinsim, unavoidable mishaps. But if the animal gets weakened, if the animal loses its value, the renter is not chayiv for that. So it's true you have some responsibility for theft, an unavoidable mishap, etc., but it's not really 100% yours. And rather, says the Gemara, you know what this is comparable to? It's comparable to the end of the Mishnah. That's in if you evaluate an animal, you do not get to feed it karshinei truma. If the kohen bought it from the Yisrael, then yachilu karshinei truma. So says the Gemara, it will, that's the Gemara's discussion of the Raya from the Mishnah. So says the Gemara, we had a machlekes Rav Ami and Rav Yehuda, who gets back to Soin Barzel. Rav Yehuda said she does, Rav Ami said he does. Yosef, Rabba, Rav Yosef, Shil Birka, Rav Nachman, Yosef, Kamri, Rav Yamr, and Yosef were sitting about 20 lines down. First one line is Yosef and Yosvi, and they were sitting in the yeshiva of Nachman, and they were saying, Tani Kavasi, Rav Yehuda, Tani Kavasi, Rav Ami. We have two Rayas, a Raya to Rav Yehuda, a Raya to Rav Ami. Tani Kavasi, Rav Ami. We have a Raya to Rav Ami that goes to him. If the husband knocks out the eye of the Eved of the Tzayin Barzel, they go free. Halacha being, when you knock out the eye of the tooth, the Eved goes free. But it's only if the husband knocks out the eye, not the woman. Clearly the reason being that it's only if the master knocks out the eye. So we see when we have these avodim of Tzayin Barzel, who's called the master? Who's called the owner? The husband. Arayat Rav Ami, that Adin Imoi, that he wins. Tani Kavas Rav Yehuda, Machnes Shom, the Bible, someone brings in an evaluated item for into the marriage, the husband cannot sell it. Not only that, even if he brings into the marriage something, evaluate a property of his own, but says the Gemara, that's the Brisa. But what happens if Machu Shnehem Libar Nasa? Are they both collectively allowed to sell it for support? This was the story in front of Shimon Gamliel. The husband wins. So what do we see from this Brisa? We see that you're not allowed to sell the Soim Barzel properties, and this goes with Rabbi Yehuda, that it has to do with the husband. So Amar Rava, as we conclude today's shir, Amar Rava, Amar Nachman Halachik Rav Yehuda, Amar Li Rava, Rav Nachman, Tanika Vasei Rav Hami. We have a rice like Rav Hami. Explains the Gemara of Tanika Vasei Rav Hami, Mistavra Taima Rav Yehuda. Why the Svara wins? Mishum Shevach Beis Aviyah, because it came from the family's household. It came from the ancestral field. Therefore, says the Gemara, we're going to go with the Svara Hadini Imai. He wins. Adin Hima, she wins like Rav Yehuda. We'll pick it up from Ahiyah to the next story in the next year.